Florida manatees are the iconic gentle giants of the southeastern coast of the United States. They do not compete with people for food or habitat. They pose no physical threat to swimmers or anyone else, yet their existence is threatened by people. Boat strikes, entanglements in trash, and food shortages exacerbated by pollution hinder the recovery of manatees in the United States. Individually, though, manatees are remarkable for their toughness and resilience. They can recover from extreme trauma, even if the injury is something they would never experience in the absence of people and the dangers that we create. Hi, everyone. My name is Mike Fitz. I'm the resident naturalist with explore.org, the world's largest live nature cam network. We watch manatees on explore.org in protected places where they gather around warm water springs in the wintertime. Manatees are a protected species no matter where they reside, but outside of a few strictly managed wintertime refuges, they face a gauntlet of dangers imposed by people. The bad news is that manatees remain threatened by human activities and behaviors. The good news is that manatees are resilient and people can help secure their future. In our program today, we want to discuss the resilience of manatees, their stories, because their stories illustrate the ways in which they are survivors, and it offers a lot of hope for the future of the species, especially if we give them the space. Florida manatees are the iconic gentle giants of the southeast. They need to survive. States. They do not compete with I'm going to pause right before we bring in our guest. I want to pause for just one moment because, Candace, if I can send you a message, I am hearing myself. It's like a delayed loop by about 1 minute or so. So I'm not sure what's going on there. Though, manatees are remarkable for their toughness and resilience. They can recover from extreme trauma, even if the injury is something they would never experience in the absence of people and the dangers that we create. Hi, everyone. My name is Mike Fitz. I'm okay. That's what's going on. All right. Well, sorry. Live Nature Cam Network. We watch manatees. Anyway, it's my fault, folks, that things were, maybe you could hear it. Maybe you couldn't. Anyway, thanks for bearing with me. We're talking about manatees. I fixed my own problem, which is good. So let's bring in our manatee expert today to help us learn more about manatees and their resilience. Sorry for the delay, Cora, but I'm joined by Cora Berchem, who is the Director of Multimedia and a Manatee Research Associate for Save the Manatee Club. Cora, great to speak with you again, and thanks for being here today. I know you've had a busy day.
Yeah, absolutely. Always happy to talk to the audience here about manatees.
And I want to remind our audience to ask us questions about manatees. So if you do have questions about manatees, drop those in the comments. We'll be looking for them during the broadcast today. But to begin, I want to introduce the idea of resilience as it applies to manatees. So for our audience, what characteristics would you ascribe to a slow-moving, pudgy-looking animal? Because a casual glance at a manatee's body shape and lifestyle, to me at least, doesn't scream resilience or toughness. So perhaps you might describe them as soft or sluggish or lazy. Maybe their lack of facial expressions and vocalizations make them appear dim-witted. Their scars and wounds even could give you the impression that they're poorly adapted for survival in the modern world. And those descriptions, I think, really say more about our perceptions, my perceptions of manatees, rather than the real adaptations and capabilities of manatees. Resilience is the capacity to recover from difficulties, and manatees are more resilient than their outward appearance suggests. Yet every organism, Cora, experiences limits to their resiliency, and this in part explains why manatees gather where they do in the wintertime. So why are we seeing manatees gathering at specific places in Florida in the winter?
Yeah, so especially this week, if you have watched our live webcams, either via Blue Spring or Homosassa, you've probably seen very large amount of manatees, and they come to these warm water sites when the ambient temperatures, for example, the St. John's River over Blue Spring, drops below 68 degrees. So the spring water is always 72 or 22 Celsius, which is the perfect warm water hot tub for manatees. And you may ask, why such a big blubbery animal? Why do they need that warm water? But manatees actually only have about an inch of fat layer, which is not a lot for such a large animal. So very unlike walruses or seals or sea lions. So manatees are really not adapted to the cold water, and they have to come to these warm water sites for survival in the wintertime, because otherwise they can get a condition called cold stress syndrome. So although what we've just heard, manatees are very resilient, and I think we're going to talk about that some more during the program, they do have definitely those thermal limits and have to come to these warm water sites when it gets cold. So you'll see hundreds of them this time of year congregating there.
And I'd like our audience to consider that as part of the resilience of manatees. I mean, they know how to survive when conditions are marginal for them. Their gatherings are the result of really like purposeful and learned behavior. So they exploit habitat features to improve their comfort and survival. And it also offers us with ways to get to know them. And this is something that you do, I think, probably every day in the winter, right, Cora? So what opportunities do wintertime aggregations of manatees offer science and conservation?
Yes, so what we do every day in the winter time is we go out on our research canoe under several different federal and state permits, and we count the manatees at these warm water sites here at Blue Spring State Park, as you can see us there on our research canoe. And we don't just count the manatees, we also identify the individuals. And how we do that is by the scar patterns that they have. So most manatees have some sort of scars on them, mostly from strikes with watercraft, as well as some from cold stress or entanglements. So that's how we keep the different individuals apart. And these wintertime aggregations are really the perfect, so to speak, place to conduct that research and see all these individuals coming back. So we compare scars from over the years. We see, who's coming back, who may have a calf, like all those kind of things. So that's the research that we do over at Blue Spring. And other researchers do it at other places too. So for example, at Homosassa Springs and other springs and power plant aggregation sites as well.
And they're only living, part of the year at these warm water springs, so it's not year-round habitat for them. Where are they going the rest of the year, and what sort of threats might they experience as when they're away from those wintertime refuges?
Yeah, so manatees can live in both salt, fresh, and brackish water and go in between. So they will be found in like rivers, estuaries, coastal areas, usually fairly shallow water, since they eat vegetation and that usually grows in rather shallow water. So just for example, some of the manatees at Blue Spring in the summertime, where we don't know where all of them go, but we do know that some spend their entire life in the St. Johns River, which is fresh water. Some will swim north all the way up the coast to Jacksonville and then go out into the Atlantic Ocean. And then some will go south. So we have some that go down to like Fort Lauderdale or Miami. We even have some that go to South Carolina or Georgia. So they definitely travel. And as you were talking about dangers that they're facing, especially when they're traveling like that, is obviously watercraft collisions, as well as entanglements in fishing gear, entrapment, all those kinds of things. So while they're pretty safe in their winter homes, in their springs, although they do have to go out and eat, which poses a danger for them as well when they're going out and encountering boats and other things. Boats are definitely, still one of the major threats that they face when they travel around, especially during the summer months.
Let's talk more about how those risks have impacted individual manatees. Because you have some stories that you want to share about several individuals that you've got to know and seen how tough they actually are. And I think these stories might help us to better understand the resilient capabilities of manatees. We can start with boat strikes, because that's unfortunately like a common and life-threatening injury for manatees. And each death, each injury by a boat strike, it really is a tragedy for them. But the resilience of manatees is also expressed, I think, by the fight that they display when they're trying to survive. Really, what is catastrophic injuries. And Corey, you wanted to share to begin a few stories about this, but one I think we can begin with is the story of a manatee nicknamed Leslie.
So, yes, absolutely. So I always like to share these kind of stories because it brings home like really what we work with and all these individuals and individual animals. So here we see Leslie. So she was a Blue Spring Manatee and she is pretty much a regular. She did get hit by a boat. I believe it was in like 2014 or 2016, and the injury actually seemed to be healing pretty well. You kind of can see there's this lump on her back, but it seemed to be healing, and we really weren't all that concerned because manatees they can heal pretty well. But then fast forward to 2018, we saw that she was actually losing a lot of body condition. She got very thin. That injury, as you can see, was kind of really sticking up. So it looked like there was definitely something going on. So we did inform our partners, about that. And we're monitoring her very closely. And unfortunately, there was definitely something more wrong with her. So they did decide to rescue her and bring her to SeaWorld Orlando for rehab. And she was in rehab for quite a few years because this injury actually had become an infection, and the infection had gone all the way into the bone. So it was really difficult to try to treat that and try to fix her up. And as you can see, she was very skinny. She had all that infection kind of, in her wound there. And although it seemed at first that she was healing pretty well, over time, we actually saw that there was something more going on, which is not always obvious on the surface. So she did go to rehab, and she was in rehab for, I believe it was about 2 years or so, maybe it was even 3 years. It was quite a while, but we were able to release her back out into the wild. So she did go back out to Blue Spring. She was doing pretty well for quite a while. I mean, obviously you can see her, her healed injury there. It's still, a scar, but you don't see that big bulging, on her back anymore. So she was doing really well. Unfortunately, she did pass away in 2023 from unknown causes, so we don't know what happened. But she was able to recover from that injury, go back out, at least have a few more years out there. And I think that just really shows how, it's just one of the examples of how resilient they are. And she was one of our adoptees, so we obviously, it was a hard hit when we lost her.
And how many of us either experience it ourselves or we know somebody who's like, oh, this old injury, man, it's really tough on me. Like, I mean, there's so many people who are kind of in the same or experience maybe similar things as like a manatee like Leslie, where you get this injury, it heals over time, but it's a recurring issue for you. Maybe it doesn't heal all the way or something like that. Or you're more prone to secondary infections because of it, whatever it happens to be. So, yeah, an example of a very tough animal. And that's a Blue Spring manatee, as I would consider her. Cora, we did have an audience question. Somebody was wondering about that area specifically. You've mentioned kind of like a couple of areas where manatees are gathering in the wintertime. Before we get to our next story, though, about individual manatees, maybe you can talk about that more. Somebody was wondering, where is this area that Cora is talking about? So you have Blue Spring, Homosassa Spring, and a few other places.
Yeah, absolutely. So Blue Spring State Park is actually northeast of Orlando. So it's between Orlando and Daytona Beach. It's the largest freshwater spring along the St. Johns River, which the St. Johns River is the biggest river in Florida. It flows south to north, which is kind of unusual. So the spring is adjacent to the St. Johns River, so that's where manatees come in the wintertime, and then they do go out to feed in the St. Johns River. So when I'm talking about they're leaving the spring and they're going into the river, I'm meaning they're leaving the sanctuary of Blue Spring State Park and they're going out into the river. Homosassa, which I also mentioned, is on the other coast. That's kind of about 60 miles north of Tampa Bay. And that's also where we have some webcams. So the photo ID research that I do is mostly at Blue Spring State Park, and most of the examples that we're talking about, they're also Blue Spring animals. Although I think we do have a Homosassa and an East Coast one too. So it doesn't just apply to Blue Spring.
And we'll get to a few more audience questions in just a little bit. But boats are such a hazard for manatees, Cora. I wanted to ask you about whether manatees can hear boats. The only time I was, I think, underwater and I had a boat nearby me, I was really actually quite shocked that I couldn't hear it very well. But my ears, human ears, aren't really adapted for that sort of like water interface. So we probably don't hear nearly as well under the water as manatees. But I'm wondering about what do we know about their ability to sense boats coming in their direction.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a question that we get all the time because a lot of people say like, why what manatees can't hear the boats, or why don't they just move out of the way of boats? manatees can hear boats. So they do hear at different frequencies than we do. They hear at much higher pitched frequencies. So sometimes it might be hard for them to hear a boat. What is even harder for them, though, is trying to locate where the boat is coming from. So as you mentioned, when we're underwater, I don't know if anyone in the audience is maybe a scuba diver. I'm a very avid scuba diver. If you're underwater, it is really difficult to tell what direction that boat is coming from. And we're not talking about a two-way highway here where you have traffic coming from two ways, but you really can have boats coming from any direction. So that's very difficult. Another thing is boats that are going very fast, the manatee may just between realizing that the boat is approaching, it may not have the ability to get out of the way fast enough. And sometimes, if it's in a shallow area, there's either way nowhere to go, or the instinct will be to dive into the deeper area, which would put it right into the boat channel. So I think there's just a lot of different things playing into that come into play here. Another thing, actually, an analogy that not analogy, but like something that my boss always emphasizes, and I'm always pretty surprised to think about that, is the speed that the boat is going at. So if a manatee is hit by a boat, there's an impact. Now, if the boat would go twice as fast, that impact wouldn't actually double, it would quadruple. So the faster a boat goes, the more dangerous that impact really is. And that's why it's so important to go slow in manatee habitat, because even if you do hit a manatee, if you hit it at a lower speed, not saying that's going to be great, but it might be less dangerous for the manatee than hitting it at a very high speed. And it gives the manatee and you more time to react and try to get out of the way.
And a related audience question, people might be wondering, well, where are they living? What is their preferred habitats when they're away from these springs? And that's maybe one way that we can be mindful of our potential impacts on them. If we know, hey, this is where manatees are likely to be. So somebody was wondering, I think actually the first question submitted to us, where do they live when they're not at their freshwater spring sites in Florida?
Yeah, you usually find them in shallow water since they do eat vegetation. They don't really go out into the large open ocean because you won't really find seagrasses or anything like that, like 60 or 80 feet underwater. So they will be in shallow areas, usually shallow coastal areas, estuaries, rivers. So they, can live in salt, fresh, and brackish water. So they can really go, from one to another area, but usually shallow areas. And a lot of areas are designated idle or slow speed zones or manatee zones. So those are indications that manatees do utilize those areas. So those signs are up there for a reason because manatees have been spotted in those areas.
There's another manatee that you wanted to talk about. I should have asked you how to pronounce her name. Freya?
Freya, yes.
Freya. Okay. Yeah. So this is another manatee that experienced a boat strike as a juvenile, and it has somewhat of a similar story arc to the manatee that we just talked about before, Leslie.
Yes, so Freya was actually, and I feel she's an example for a lot of manatees that we see nowadays. We actually just had two that are very similar to her at Blue Springs. So she did get hit as a juvenile manatee, and she was actually one that we observed very closely for our partners because her injuries seemed pretty severe. I mean, they seemed pretty significant, very deep wounds there, but she was moving along pretty okay. Her body condition was fine, her behavior was fine. So we actually decided to, along with our partners, to just, observe and see how she was doing, because sometimes the stress of conducting a rescue for these animals can actually make things worse. We could open these wounds more, they may struggle in a net. So it's always a really fine balance between trying to see, okay, does this manatee really need rescue or are they able to heal on their own? So Freya, although these injuries looked horrific and that was really hard to watch, and we have one of a similar injury right now, actually at Blue Spring, she was able to completely heal on her own, and we could not believe it when she came back the next year. And as you can see in this video here, her injury had completely healed, and those were, healed gray scars with a little bit of white in there. But, we could still identify her. We know that is Freya, but it's just remarkable to see how some of these animals really are able to heal on their own. And I think it really puts things into perspective, honestly, because, that was one, unlike Leslie, who we did end up rescuing because her body condition was really, really declining. Freya was one of those that we didn't even intervene, and she was doing just fine, which is amazing to me.
And let's talk about the manatee nicknamed China as well. So this is another one that you knew who suffered a boat strike. But what about China's story?
Yeah, China, again, very similar to Freya. I just always like to point her out because she's also kind of funny ID-wise. So she also suffered a pretty significant injury to her upper body, as you can see there on her shoulder area. And she, again, was one that we monitored very closely to see, if that would heal on its own or if she would need rescue. Back in the day when I first started, I just talked to Wayne Hartley, our main researcher today. I wanted to rescue everybody. I said, oh, this is a horrific injury. That manatee needs to come in. I think the last 10 years have really shown me that these animals, they can heal so well without us interfering with them that, maybe monitoring and them might actually be better than pulling her out. And there she is, a year later, actually with a calf. And as you can see, there's a little, white scar there where those deep cuts were, and she's completely healed, and there she's even nursing a calf. And that was the season after this injury happened, and then she kind of disappeared. We didn't see her for several years, and sometimes they go off to other warm water sites. However, we did have a manatee that came in with a scar on like her tail, above her tail, that we named Nasima, I think we named her. That was a pretty significant scar, kind of an interesting pattern. And just this season, we actually got a really good look at the entire animal, and we realized this is China. China had got a new scar, but you can still, if you look really closely in that picture, can see those deep healed scars there on her left shoulder. So that just shows you sometimes with our photo ID, even we can make mistakes. We get so focused on these new, very significant scars that sometimes we don't even see the old healed gray scars. So we got rid of the name Nasima, and we're back to China, and China has been there all along, and she actually has a calf again this season. So she's still doing well.
I'll be looking for her on the webcams then. And there's one more manatee we want to talk about in relation to boat strikes, because this manatee really seems like the example of resilience in the face of trauma and boat strikes. And her nickname is Reckless. I don't know how you got that nickname, but it's an amazing story.
Yes, so Reckless, actually, just so quickly how she got her name. She was actually named by Dr. Stacy at SeaWorld Orlando. She is one of their senior vets who was able to treat Reckless for her horrific injuries. And then she was able to name her. And Reckless was named after a war horse who went through so much and somehow came out alive. So I believe I don't know the exact backstory about the war horse, but that's how Reckless got her name.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. So Reckless she's not a blue spring manatee. She was actually somebody we rescued on the East Coast, and this is her in rehabilitation here. She's getting some treatments there at SeaWorld Orlando, who did a terrific job rehabilitating that animal. We rescued her with her newborn calf. And I don't even want to show photos of the rescue because it was just too horrific. And her entire shoulder was affected. She actually lost one of her pectoral flippers, which manatees are able to survive with just one flipper. But it was just somebody we never ever thought would make it through the rescue, the transport, and then the rehab. And she even went through some physical therapy. She was in rehab for quite a while. And here you can see her feeding on some lettuce there during her rehab. So she just really beat all odds, and then all the partners were able to release her in, I believe it was early 2024. You can see here, this is I thought this was a really cute little video of SeaWorld put together. That she's loaded into the truck. That also answers some people's questions on how do we transport manatees. So they are put into this stretcher, and then they're put into a truck for the transport. And Reckless was an extremely large animal. I believe she weighed in at about 2,400 pounds, so very large female. So she is transported in this truck, and then she's going to her release site. She's getting some measurements there. This is actually her calf at this point, at the age where it's being weaned. So you can see how many people it takes to just to move the stretcher with Reckless there. And this is her at the release site. As you can see, that is a pretty, pretty drastic scar there. And they're actually marking her existing scars right now from previous injuries. And that's being photographed. So if you're wondering kind of what these markings are, lots of people ask us about that. They're actually marking the scars for photo ID to record them. And there she and her calf Churro are being released back out into the wild, which is pretty amazing that they made it. And the reason why I thought we should mention her too is she was just resighted this winter, just last week, and she has a calf again. So not only was she able to survive the injury, she was actually able to reproduce again, which when we rescued her, I would never have thought that possible. So I think she's just the example for a resilient manatee.
Yeah, just an amazing story of recovery there. And before we move on from Reckless, at the very end of that video, we could see that there was basically like a bobber kind of trailing behind her as she was released. Somebody or one of our audience members was wondering, do they get tagged? So do the manatees get tagged occasionally? They do. Most of them don't. But can you talk more about that process and why you're doing it and when you don't?
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm actually really glad that somebody asked that. I almost overlooked that already. Yes, so some manatees will get tagged, and the way manatees get tagged, it's a belt that goes around what we call the peduncle. It's the area between the tail and the body, and attached to that is a 3 to 4 foot long tether, as you can see here, and then the satellite is floating on the top. And it might seem quite a cumbersome, but it's actually has a couple of breakaway points. If the manatee does get tangled in something, it will come off. It's been tested. They can, swim with it. It will dive down with them. They can mate with it. They can reproduce. They can do all their natural behaviors with the tags. Most of the manatees that do get tagged are manatees that were rescued as orphaned calves. So for the first year after their release, they're being tagged so researchers can make sure that they adapt back to being out in the wild, whether that means going out to feed, coming back to a warm water site. So they have the ability to kind of see that the manatee's doing okay. In Reckless's case, they wanted to also make sure that she was doing okay, but they also wanted to see kind of her movement patterns because she had been seen all the way up in Edgewater, which is kind of on the northern end of the Indian River Lagoon in Florida. She had also been seen down in Fort Lauderdale. She also traveled into Lake Okeechobee and the St. Lucie River, so it was interesting to see kind of her movements. And her calf Churro was actually tagged to make sure that she would adapt to being out in the wild because she had not had that experience being a wild manatee.
Yeah, I love how some manatees are just homebodies and they're just like, yeah, I'm just going to hang out in this area all year. And then some are like, heck, I'm going to North Carolina, and they do. So yeah, a lot of variation there. And then we talked about this, I think, as we were planning our program, and I'm not sure if you're able to look into it because it's a hard question to answer. I don't know if anyone's really studied the physiology and metabolism of manatees closely enough to know this. But what do we know about their physiology, their metabolism that allows them to heal from trauma like this? Because it's not something that they evolved to deal with. It's not like they're out there beating each other up like you see other animals competing for territory, or a carnivore has to sometimes tackle big prey and sometimes they get injured in that regard. Manatees are just out there eating seagrass and they're very gentle animals next to one another. So what do we know about their ability to heal, if anything?
I mean, it still amazes me, what kind of injuries they can come back from. I think one physiological aspect of manatees that is really interesting to me is that they have very large lungs. They extend almost all the way from their head down towards the tail. So, that's also what they use to control their buoyancy is those large lungs and those heavy bones. But most animals and humans, we have a diaphragm. Manatees actually have a hemidiaphragm, so they can control the air volume in their lungs separately. So sometimes we have manatees that are severely injured and actually have one collapsed lung and can still live with having that one healthy lung, which I think
Wow.
that's a I don't want to say it's an adaptation because manatees haven't really adapted to get hit by boats in terms of like, oh, well, if one lung gets hit by a boat, we're going to use the other lung to stay alive. So I think it's just something that they have, and that's really helping them out in those kind of situations. Other than that, like metabolic wise, I'm not entirely sure. I still don't know what it is that makes them heal so well, and what kind of their pain tolerance is, because you're looking at some of these injuries and you just think, oh my God, like how can this animal survive? That would put me in the hospital for months, and some of these animals just they don't even need any help, quote unquote. I think what sometimes gets me the most if I hear from people, well, why are manatees too stupid or too slow to move out of the way of boats? Well, manatees never really had to evolve to, move out of the way. They're slow moving, they eat vegetation. It's not that they have to hunt for their prey like, carnivores do or other marine mammals do. So the fact that they can avoid these boats and that they have kind of like adapted to living in an environment where there's lots of boats, lots of people living on the coast. I think that is pretty amazing, and I think we should give them credit for that because they're not really built to, avoid boats. That's just something that they had to deal with as time went by.
Yes, and let's not ignore the fact that people do they behave in all sorts of risky ways that we know are extremely dangerous, and we know we are consciously sort of processing this is a bad idea. I'm going to hold my beer, and we still do it anyway. Um, so, speaking before we move on from boats, somebody was wondering about like rules associated with boating in manatee habitats. So somebody was wondering, is there legislation against outboard motor use in manatee areas? Is it being enforced? It probably varies from state to state and jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but maybe you could talk specifically about what happens in Florida.
Yes, so we do have several areas that are designated, slow speed zones, idle speed, or even no entry zones, so where motorboats are prohibited. Obviously, boats cannot be prohibited in every waterway that manatees are using because Florida it is the boating capital of the world, and we do have manatees, so there's no way we can, prohibit boats from entering every single waterway that a manatee could potentially be in. I think one of the main things is really education and the signage for people to understand, okay, there are manatees in this area. What are the signs that I can do to look out for manatees, looking for these swirls on top of the water the manatee makes with its tail when it swims, wearing polarized sunglasses to, be able to see things that are below the surface. Like I said earlier, going slow in areas where manatees might be. Also, I mean, we do talk a lot about propeller guards, which are definitely, a step in the right direction that can only be made mandatory by the Coast Guard. We at Save the Manatee Club, we are certainly in favor of prop guards. However, you need to make sure that you're using it combined with slow speed because just putting a prop guard around your propeller, lots of people think that's the number one solution, but we don't want to get that false sense of security as in I have a prop guard and now I can do whatever I want out there. Because I'm not hurting manatees because my prop is secure. Actually, about 60% of manatee mortalities from boat strikes are from the impact trauma of a fast-moving boat. And that can be anything from a jet ski to, a larger boat or smaller power boat. So just having that propeller guard is definitely not like the number one thing to fix all these issues. And we do have law enforcement out on the waterways. I mean, not nearly enough, unfortunately. But we do have FWC and local sheriff officers out there, monitoring those boat speed zones, and they do enforce that. But it's Florida. We have a lot of waterways and we have a lot of boaters, so I don't think it's feasible to enforce every single area. I wish it was, but I think we have to be realistic that that's not going to happen.
So boat strikes are one of those immediate tangible impacts, direct impacts that people can have on manatees. But there's others that are a bit more indirect. Things like maybe malnutrition, starvation problems. Those are risks that manatees face because of people. So Cora, how do human activities affect manatee food sources? And how does that or did that affect the manatee that you introduced me to? It's the story of Mermaid.
Yes, so I mean, we've talked about boats so far, but manatees are really facing, a variety of threats. And I think a lot of us have probably heard about manatees starving to death because there just wasn't enough vegetation, there wasn't enough food sources. And a lot of the food sources disappearing was actually from all these nutrients getting into the waterways. So this was from, agriculture, lawn fertilizer, leaking septic tanks, sewage spills. So it's just a slew of things that is coming from humans on land and making its way into the waterways, and that would then cloud the water, and the seagrass or the vegetation that grows below cannot grow to the point where it survives and manatees can feed on it. So we did have a lot of emaciated and starving manatees on the east coast. We're also seeing those kind of issues in on the West Coast, for example, in Crystal River and Homosassa, where here we have manatee mermaid, and you can see this is not really what a manatee should look like. It has what we call a peanut head, and it's also pretty emaciated. She was named mermaid because she had that. Well, she did have an injury from a boat on her fluke there as well, but that was healed and not very severe. But as you can see, she is, pretty emaciated, and that was also because she was not finding enough food. So here she is, on our webcams. We were seeing her, and she was also seen by the park staff and FWC, who eventually did intervene and rescue her. And she went to Zoo Tampa and to Epcot at Disney for recovery, and then she was released back out into the wild early this winter, and she did make an appearance on our webcams. I want to say it was like right before New Year's or right around Christmas. So it was really nice to see her, healthy and round again. This is what a manatee is supposed to look like. And there she is again, coming by on our webcam and doing well. So not always a boat injury that manatees get rescued for, but emaciation and lack of food sources can be a problem too. So hopefully she'll stay in good shape now going forward. And you can definitely look for her on our webcams because she's pretty easy to identify. She has that kind of dolphin or mermaid shaped tail. So pretty easy to spot.
And then sometimes things just happen to manatees, and maybe we don't know what caused like a calf to get separated from its mother. Sometimes you do. Sometimes hey, the mother died for this reason or that reason. Sometimes orphans are just separated for unknown reasons. But calves, they're able to adapt, I think, and this is one of the other ways that I find incredible about manatees is that you get these orphan calves that at least initially they seem to adapt from their separation from their mothers. So how does can you tell us the story of Mary Kate, and maybe that'll help us to better understand how young manatees express resilience in the face of that challenge, just being without their parent?
Absolutely, yeah. So I feel we have some sort of orphan calves at Blue Spring almost every single season. And with orphan calves, again, it's something we monitor very closely alongside our partners because manatees sometimes will adopt orphan calves. So if that's the case, we don't want to interfere. We want to make sure if there is a possibility that these calves are being nursed by other mothers, whether it's one mother adopting or whether it's a manatee being able to kind of go around and nurse on different moms and making it through the winter, then we don't want to interfere because, rescuing a calf, that's going to be a 2 to 3 year commitment in a rehab facility. And that's also taking the manatee out of its environment where it needs to learn for these first 1 or 2 years of its life. And taking that experience away from that manatee makes it really difficult upon release to make sure that these animals are doing well. So with Mary Kate, again, we spent several weeks monitoring her, and she was kind of going around trying to nurse on different mothers, and sometimes they can hang in for a really long time. I think we started monitoring her in early December, and then we ended up rescuing her in mid-January. But here you can see how she's kind of trying to bond with that mom. We did see her going up like that to different mothers, which again, we can tell the mothers apart by their scars, to make sure that it wasn't just a calf that wasn't doing well but had a mom, but it was actually just going around and trying to kind of nurse on different mothers. And we even saw some mothers allowing it. Most mothers were pushing it away. Some were kind of chasing it all over the spring run. And as you can see, we really saw the body condition declining. It had like these folds on its ventrum. We also see what we call a peanut head, which is that dent kind of behind the skull there. That's not really something you want to see in a manatee. You don't want to see that in a calf or in an adult. So we monitored that very closely, and towards the end, she was just kind of sitting by herself there, and no other manatees around, and she wasn't quite ready to give up on herself, but she was definitely not in a state where she was able to really make it out there a lot longer on her own. So her rescue still to this day kind of stands out to me because oftentimes we use a hoop net from the rescue boat to get these calves, but with her, we actually had one of my co-workers from the FWC take the hoop net out on the canoe with me, and here that's me paddling the research canoe and my coworker with the hoop net, and we were actually able to hoop net little Mary Kate from the canoe, which we were pretty amazed that we did not tip the canoe over. I think everyone was prepared for that to happen. It didn't, so I have to give Sarah, who's here with the hoop net, a lot of kudos for that. She's very skilled at doing that. So we were able to get Mary Kate out of there, and she went to First, she went to SeaWorld for critical care, and then she was transferred to the Columbus Zoo for continued care as part of the Manatee Rescue and Rehab Partnership. And we released her back out into the wild in, I want to say now it was 2024. And that is me and Sarah from FWC, who was the one who hoop netted her. And as you can see, there's Mary Kate, big female, big girl. She was also tagged, like we just talked about, since she didn't have that experience in the wild. So she did go back out, and we're super happy to see her coming back to Blue Spring now. We did see her a couple of weeks ago, and here's just a quick picture of her, and she looks really good. So she graduated from the program. She's no longer tagged. She has, done everything that they wanted to see. She's going out to eat. She's coming back for the warm water. So, and since she is a female, we are hoping that maybe one day she'll have calves of her own. So that's a really nice kind of, full circle to see from a little orphan calf how well she's doing now. So we have high hopes for her for the future.
And that, and the other examples that we've shared. I mean, I think they are, each one of them, a unique example of resilience in manatees, and it's also an example of the empathy of people, the commitment of people who work to ensure their survival. It seems like a difficult job, Cora, and really the first step is looking and being able to identify signs of distress in manatees. Sometimes it's obvious, like if they have a fresh injury from a boat strike. A lot of times it's not, if they're dealing with something else. So what you've mentioned a few things like the peanut head and things like that. So what signs and behaviors do manatees display when they are in distress, or maybe not in a condition well, I guess I'll just cut myself short. What signs or behaviors do manatees display when they are in distress?
Yes, I mean, some signs, like you mentioned, that, obvious if they have, an entanglement on, say, their flipper, or they do have a fresh boat strike. That's obviously like an external sign that something is wrong, but also just like looking at the animal as a whole. You want to make sure that you do not see that are not emaciated, that do have not have a peanut head, those external signs you want to look at. So for researchers like myself, we also look at the manatee's behavior. So, for example, is it agitated, or is it resting? Is it resting in very shallow water? Then the respiration rate, that's one of the most important things. And that's also what we tell people. If you see a manatee and you think it's in distress, if you call it in, oftentimes you're asked to measure its respiration rate. And a healthy manatee will come up for air about every 2 to 5 minutes. They can stay down when they're resting for up to 20 minutes. If you have a manatee that's coming up to surface about every 30 seconds, that's a really good indication that something is wrong, especially if the animal isn't moving around a lot. If they're kind of stationary and they're breathing pretty rapidly, that could be a lung problem. It could be a sign of cold stress syndrome. It could be any sort of, distress sign. So we always measure respiration very closely. Sometimes we spend about 30 minutes to an hour with the animal and just see like how many times does it come up for air. We recently had a cold stressed manatee at Blue Spring. It was a pretty large mom with a calf. The calf was in really great shape, but the mom had like a very bleached face. Her pectoral flippers and her tail were almost white. So external signs were, we were a little worried about that, but we observed her very closely. She was in very good body condition. She was very round. There were no signs of emaciation. The respiration was normal. So she kept going out to eat and she kept coming back. So those are all good signs you want to look to as well. Now, when it's warming up and you have manatees like kind of staying behind and being very stationary when everyone else is leaving to go feed, that's another indication that there might be something going on. So it does take some time. It's not something that I can look at and say, okay, this is wrong, this needs to be rescued. Sometimes, it takes days or even weeks of observing to see, how is that animal doing. We're also looking for any changes in behavior. Do we see things worsening? If we have an open wound, do we see that it's healing, or do we see that, the manatee is getting more lethargic, or the manatee is not leaving to go out and eat? Those are all kind of things that we're looking for. And sometimes it takes quite a while to figure that out.
Yeah, it sounds like you need a lot of careful observation to make the right determination. So what should a person do? Like, let's say there's just some weirdo like me. I'm hanging out on the shoreline somewhere in Florida, and I see a manatee, and I'm like, that doesn't seem right to me. What should a person do in that situation?
Yes, so the number one thing you would want to do is call the FWC Wildlife Alert Hotline. The number is 1-888-404-3922. You can also Google that. We also have Save the Manatee Club have stickers that you can get free of charge to kind of put on your boat or your paddleboard with that number. So you would want to call that number and let them know what you're seeing. If you can safely take photos or video of the animal without getting too close to disturb it, you would want to do that. You would want to look for, is the manatee level in the water or is it maybe floating high? Again, like what I said, the respiration, you want to look at that. And when you call the hotline, they will put you in touch with a biologist who is covering your area. So if you somehow can stay with the manatee, try to do that. Sometimes they get reports hours after, a boat or somebody's out on the water and says, well, 6 hours ago I saw a manatee and I think it was kind of high. I didn't take any pictures. I don't know exactly what it was. That's very difficult to then, verify and relocate the animal. So, if you can do any of those things, if you're outside of Florida and you see a manatee, there are local stranding networks you can call. So, Georgia, the Carolinas, Louisiana, Alabama, they all have stranding networks you can call and they're all connected. So, they can, go out and check on the animal. What we do not want you to do is try to take matters in your own hands. So, if you see a stranded manatee, for example, manatees do not come out and bask like sea lions or seals do. So, do not push it back into the water. If you see an entanglement, don't try to cut that off. That can actually cause more harm than good. So definitely do call that hotline. And if they do want you to take any sort of action, they will tell you.
And there's been so much time and effort committed to manatee conservation over the last several decades. So, how has the population of Florida manatees changed since they were listed as an endangered species?
Yeah, so the numbers have definitely gone up. When the surveys first began in like the 70s or 80s, there were probably only about 1,500 to 2,000 manatees. Now the numbers are ranging somewhere between 8 and 11,000. So we definitely see more manatees, which is a good thing. I think it's a conservation success, at least in certain areas. For example, Blue Spring, we're seeing the population doing really, really well. We went from 36 manatees back in 1980 to over 800 today in a single day. However, you also need to look at the threats that they're facing, and we had the large unusual mortality event happening in the Indian River Lagoon between 2021 and 2025, and we lost, over 1,000 manatees just in 2021 alone, and that's a huge amount of manatees to lose, especially manatees of reproductive age in just a single year. So we have to be very, very cautious with just relying on high numbers. We really need to make sure we tackle all these threats as well.
And you mentioned that recently you've counted some uh, very high numbers of manatees like hanging out at Blue Spring State Park. Like you had a day recently that was more than 800 manatees. In late January, you had some days where it was like 770 manatees hanging out in that area. Somebody was wondering from our audience if there was a concern. This person writes, is there a concern of too many manatees occupying a spring area? And are there any concerns of potential nutrient loading from that?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's actually a question we do get quite a lot. So we also sometimes hear, that manatees kind of have eaten themselves out of house and home, or that they destroy the seagrasses or mess with the water quality. Well, if manatees were actually in balance with the seagrasses in the ecosystem, their fecal matter will actually fertilize the seagrasses and the vegetation that will grow. It's going to be in a natural state where it will grow just fine. It's not that too many manatees are kind of destroying that. It's more so the nutrients that we as humans have added to the water that have caused these issues. Now, manatees occupying a spring, at Blue Spring, we still have areas of the spring where there's actually no manatees. They kind of congregate in one big section, and then there's a section where we don't have many, and then they're kind of scattered out. So there's definitely enough room for them. They do come in there for the warm water, but then they will go out to feed. So they're not coming in there in, say, mid-November, and then they're going to stay there for 4 months straight in the spring, and then they'll move out. So I don't really think there's concern of them, of the potential nutrient loading. They do water quality testing both at Blue Spring as well as in other sites and the river all the time. So if there were concerns, they would definitely, point it out. The major concerns we have for Blue Spring right now is the nutrient loading that goes in from all the septic systems in the Blue Spring spring shed area. It's primarily the Berry, Deltona, and the land, what is going into the water. So that's why we see all that algae growth and the spring kind of looking green. It's not necessarily because of the 800 manatees in there, it is because of the nutrients that are coming from all these human sources, which is, a big concern, in addition to the spring flow decreasing as well, from overpumping for human consumption as well. But it's a good question because we get that a lot.
And at the beginning of the program, I mentioned that resilience has limits. So an additional factor that challenges the resilience of manatees is ecosystem change and habitat change. It's just not changes that are happening to the water; it's what people are doing to the land as well. So how is the rate of ecosystem change in Florida challenging the overall resilience of manatees?
I think overall, the ecosystem change is pretty fast. I mean, just looking how many buildings, how many high rises, how much construction is going up all the time, and most people want to live close to the water. They want to live close to the coast. So it's obviously challenging both for the environment as well as for manatees to cope with that. And I think it's a pretty fast change. I sometimes like to use one of our oldest manatees, Paddy Doyle, who I mentioned briefly before we started the program. He was an original blue spring manatee in 1970, and he did pass away last year. So he was well over 50 years old, maybe even older than that. And just the amount of change that he has seen in his lifetime from coming to Blue Spring when there were fewer manatees, fewer boat traffic, and then going using that habitat, using these areas now, like the kind of change that he's seen over his lifetime, are pretty crazy. And I mean, I've only been living in Florida for 12 years, and the amount of change I have seen is astonishing to me. Just, how much of natural area has been transformed into, apartment complexes. But then there's also areas like Blue Spring, for example, and other state parks that are protected public lands. So we definitely need that, not just for the manatees, but just in general for, the environment in general.
And oftentimes, people, we want to help like directly. Like we see a manatee, it's maybe curious about us. Like, hey, I want to give it a drink. I want to give it some food. We know we don't want people to do that. But sometimes on the webcams, even there's like bits of lettuce floating in the water, like at Homosassa Spring. And we did get a question about that. So maybe Cora, you can talk about, or emphasize the need to leave wild manatees alone. But what are people seeing at Homosassa Springs? Because sometimes, or one person wrote in and said, I've seen what looks like lettuce being fed to the manatees. Is this correct, or are they fed anything else? So I think the person's really curious about what's going on at Homosassa.
Yeah, and that's a great question. So, especially at Homosassa, it depends what time of year you're watching the webcam. So, in the winter time, the spring is open, there's a gate, and the spring is open to the wild manatees. So, wild manatees come to the spring for the warm water. There's also permanent resident manatees at Homosassa that cannot be released, and they are in the winter time in a different area that is not visible on the webcams. However, in the summertime, it actually reverses, and the wild manatees are moving out, so the gate is closed, and then the spring area is occupied by the permanent residents. Now, the permanent resident manatees are fed because they're not going back out into the wild. They are permanent. So if you do see someone, feeding them lettuce, or it's mostly romaine lettuce. Sometimes they'll get some iceberg, they may get some kale. They may get some natural diet there as well. So that's what they're going to be eating. So this is very, very different from feeding wild manatees, which that is against the law. We do not want to see that. I know we see some floating lettuce at Blue Spring every now and then. We don't want to do that. And the main reason for that really is that manatees need to go find their own food. They should not become dependent on people to, seek out food and water. And a lot of times that attracts them to boats and marinas and areas that they really shouldn't be hanging out in, and it's dangerous for them in the long run. It may look really cute. We just had a manatee this morning coming up right to the research canoe and kind of tapping its flippers on there and kind of moving around the canoe, and I'm sure it was adorable, but actually I'm very worried about that juvenile animal because it's too habituated. I don't want it to do that. And I know that, it may do that to other paddle boarders and boats out there, and they're gonna, reciprocate that behavior. They're gonna touch it and they're gonna post about it on TikTok and Instagram and all these things. And then there's other people chiming in how cute that is and, reinforcing that behavior. And the next thing I will know is that manatee gets hit by a boat. So it's just important to kind of see how our little individual actions that may not seem like much can really affect the bigger picture.
And I know that urge is really difficult to resist. I mean, just think about how fun it is when we feed our pets. Like, it's what my dog goes nuts when I feed her, and actually, she's kind of getting mad at me because it's about her dinner time right now. But that's like a really great part of the day, and those feelings can happen when we feed wild animals too. So we want to make sure that we are resisting those urges as much as we can. Cora, we're coming up on the end of our program. So besides not feeding manatees, what else can people do to help protect them?
Yeah, so I think, I've gone over a few things during the program, so I know what you're nearing the end, so I don't want to repeat myself, but, going slow in manatee habitat, wearing polarized sunglasses really makes a difference, to see manatees and other wildlife in the water, participating in any sort of cleanup events, even if you don't live near the water. A lot of things that we have on land, can blow into the water, so river cleanups, coastal cleanups, those kind of things. Not using fertilizer, especially during the summer months. If you absolutely have to fertilize, make sure you use slow release nitrogen fertilizer, so you're not fertilizing and then the next rain washes all your fertilizer right off into the waterways. If you're on a septic tank, make sure it's inspected. If you can switch to sewer, then at least make sure it's inspected regularly so that it doesn't leak into the waterways. And I think, most of all, also just educating others. There's still lots of people who come to Florida and they have never seen a manatee before. They may not know what a manatee is. I mean, I certainly did not grow up with manatees. So I think, everything you learn, whether that's on, our webcams or through our programs and, passing that on can really make a difference too.
And the methods we use to protect manatees today, those things will be necessary to sustain manatee populations in the future. Even if the population recovers to a point where we can say, like with bald eagles, bald eagles aren't on the endangered species list anymore. That happens with manatees, and we're working with, that's the goal, right? So they're not an endangered or threatened species anymore. But even after that happens, we're still going to have to utilize the methods we protect them today to make sure that their populations are healthy in the future. So it essentially, I like to think of it as making those things the status quo in our human cultures, in our communities. So they're the normal, they're the right thing to do. And as somebody who likes to consider themselves as like a professional communicator, I read a lot of research associated with conservation and how to frame things so people will understand the issues clearly. They'll be motivated to take action to help animals and wildlife. And one thing that seems to work a lot is that you want to normalize behaviors that are basically just doing the right thing. Communication that focuses solely on risk or conflict or sacrifice as it pertains to wildlife, that's less effective than normalizing behaviors that protect wildlife and communicating the benefits of living alongside wildlife. So when you're talking to people about wildlife and conservation, it's important that you don't ignore the real issues surrounding human and wildlife conflicts. But those issues, when they really need to be framed around the positive benefits of living alongside wildlife, and in basically just doing the right thing. So your goals include empowering people to do the right thing and normalizing the behaviors that protect animals and their habitats. And with those messages in mind, I asked Explore.org's graphic designer, Sarah Woolman, to come up with some posters that people can share that will help to get the message out about manatees and also, again, normalize doing the right thing. So we have a few of those that we can share. The first one that we'll bring up is we boat with manatees in mind. The other one that we will share, and I'll put these in the comments afterwards, after our program is over. That's why I couldn't hear myself at the beginning, or I was hearing an echo of myself, is because I had that window open ready to post the comments. But we had another one, respect the locals. Manatees live here, so giving them the respect that they deserve. Well, another one that I think is really important, and maybe my favorite of the bunch, is this lawn is ocean friendly. You heard Cora mentioning that a bunch of times about reducing fertilizer use, pesticide use. If you can, make that a normal part of your lawn and your neighborhood. And then another one, Florida keeps trash out of the ocean. We know that entanglements are a problem for marine mammals. and other wildlife in the ocean throughout the world. So this doesn't pertain to Florida. It certainly pertains to everywhere. And then finally, there is an election coming up in November this year, and you want to vote for people who are going to work to protect manatees. So vote for manatees as well. And we'll, again, I'll post this in the comments as soon as our program concludes here. But Cora, I always enjoy talking to you and learning more about manatees. I know that you are out there every day. Sometimes we see them or see you on the webcams doing your morning counts. What do you have to look forward to over the next month or so?
Well, I mean, I think we're, right in the midst of manatee season. We had record low temperatures here in Florida this week. So definitely looking forward to see more manatees coming back. Some of the old timers, I think, had a record number of manatees returning. So definitely looking forward to that. And we also have some releases coming up. So some of the manatees that we helped rescue in the past are getting ready for release. So excited to see them. So if you see any trackers on the webcam, you probably see some of those manatees that just went back out into their wild natural environment.
Well, excellent. We'll be looking for you to be tooling around with Wayne, doing your counts in the mornings, and we'll be enjoying the manatees otherwise on the webcams. The challenges that manatees experience are really, they're not their fault. It's humans imposing those challenges on them despite us knowing better. Their resilience, however, shows that they are survivors, and it offers a lot of hope for the future of the species, especially if we commit to giving them the space and habitat that they need. And I want to thank my guest today during our program, Cora Berchem, who is the Director of Multimedia and a Manatee Research Associate for Save the Manatee Club. Cora, great to speak with you. Thanks for being here once again.
Yeah, thank you so much.
And if you want to learn more about the work of Save the Manatee, just go to savethemanatee.org. You can always watch them at explore.org/manatee. My name is Mike Fitz with explore.org. Thanks for joining us today. Thanks for your questions, and enjoy the webcams until we talk to you again. Have a great day.